I'm Anthony J. Hall. I'm Professor of Globalization Studies at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, which is a province in Canada.
And you've written an article about the history of nuclear power. Why don't you talk about why you decided to write that article?
I wrote an article called From Hiroshima to Fukushima, 1945 to 2011. And of course, as the news started to penetrate about what had happened in Fukushima, it was poetic in a very tragic way because, of course, in 1945 the Japanese people incurred the only attack, in this case by the United States of America, on a civilian population. They were nuked. And the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the basis of a huge science experiment on human subjects. And unfortunately now we have the same phenomena with Fukushima, that the people of Japan, especially Honshu Island, have become subjects in a science experiment. There really is no precedent for this accident. It's way beyond, I immediately thought this is way beyond anything that happened at Chernobyl. As I started to investigate it and realized the 40 years of waste is on the plant, and this is the Achilles heel. I'd worked on it 25 years ago, the nuclear waste issue. It's the Achilles heel of the nuclear industry. This nuclear waste, spent fuel rods, can remain radioactive for sometimes hundreds of thousands of years, billions of years in some cases, depending upon which radionuclides we're talking about. How do you keep something separate? This radioactive material separate from the air, the water, all life forms? How can you contain it for basically all time? So that there's never been an answer to that. Any community that sees a nuclear waste dump being planned for the region invariably mobilize against it. So what they did at Fukushima, like they do in the power plants here in California, they've just been storing the waste materials on the site. And when you start to read about the juxtaposition and concentration of different types of nuclear procedures at the Fukushima plant, so you have the burning of the rods, the reactors, the spent fuel rods on top of the reactors, huge pools of waste, in some cases caskets of nuclear waste, some of which may have floated off to sea after the tsunami. You have this concentration of different procedures, so if there's a problem in one, it's going to spread to the other. Of course, the dynamic in nuclear reactions, it's a chain reaction, and we're going to see that at Fukushima. Even Toshiba is saying it's going to be 30 years. And some people say, come on, it's 100 years at least. But we're going to see it one disaster begetting another disaster, one crisis spreading into another area. And we're obviously not getting the full story. Japan is extremely, there's nuclear plants, there's reprocessing, there's a great concentration of different industrial procedures there, and I don't think we've got the full reports about what's going wrong.
Well, how is the United States involved in this?
Well, the United States, this is the U.S. nuclear industry in Japan. It is U.S. companies that built the system, that designed the system, and ultimately imposed and enforced the system on Japan. In my article from Hiroshima to Fukushima, well, first I discovered the reactors, the Mark I GE reactors, General Electric reactors, were designed in the process of building the first nuclear submarine. Admiral Rickover's unit was, the Navy had been left out of the Manhattan Project, so the Navy wanted in. So the first effort to use nuclear energy, these submarines, I hadn't realized that you can't run a diesel engine underwater. They ran in the Second World War by batteries. They could go a maximum of maybe 20 miles underwater. So this was the number one priority, to get nuclear submarines. Rickover became a kind of almost an evangelist for nuclear energy. He built a demonstration station as soon as he got the nuclear submarine Nautilus going. He built on a land base at shipping port in Pennsylvania, and this became the kind of study center from which the nuclear energy industry grew and proliferated. So the first site for exporting the U.S. nuclear energy industry was Japan.
Weren't the Japanese against nuclear energy and nuclear power?
There were protests and such against it from the very beginning, but it was it was mind-boggling really to read about the period of the U.S. occupation when the U.S. government was the government of Japan was ruling Japan. They took the old leadership from Imperial Japan, and many of the top leadership ended up in Tsukumato prison in Tokyo, one of whom was Matsutaro Shoriki, who would become the first nuclear energy czar, the first promoter. He was vehemently anti-communist, and in the atmosphere of anti-communism during the McCarthy era, the period where periodic Red Scares in the United States, anybody who had really good credentials as an anti-communist was elevated and given positions of authority. So this Shoriki had been a propagandist in Imperial Japan, a police chief, a kind of mixture of J. Edgar Hoover and William Randolph Hearst. He continued that role, and he got the first license given his anti-communist credentials. He got the first television license, commercial television license in Japan, and it was all part of this anti-communist psychological warfare initiative. The first campaign that he did on his new television station, which would become a network, was Atoms for Peace. Dwight D. Eisenhower was trying to sort of humanize the face of the nuclear energy and the nuclear industry, which of course is military at its roots. General Electric got into the business to build Fat Man and Little Boy, the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and people in the early 1950s were freaking out really because the Soviet Union was testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. United States was as well. It looked like the world was being prepared to be destroyed, and in an effort to kind of calm the public, Eisenhower came up with this Atoms for Peace idea.
They've come from General Electric.
And of course, in that era, or shortly following that, General Electric had as its spokesperson an actor who kind of betrayed his union roots and went to the executive side in General Electric. His name was Ronald Reagan. So General Electric was obviously doing, making military, chief military contractor, and then if you could spin out aspects of this nuclear industry or all kinds of military production into sort of civilian uses, that's been the kind of pattern of the U.S. economy in that period, and to this day, really, the heart and soul of the economy is military-industrial complex, and the civilian economy kind of runs as a spin-off out of this, and we're seeing classic. The nuclear industry is classically that. So we've got to always remind ourselves this was a propaganda ploy. These nuclear peaceful uses of nuclear energy. This was an effort to make the weapons manufacturers, the military contractors, to give them a kind of human face. But of course we know that the plutonium that nuclear power plants produces that's necessary for the building of nuclear bombs. And we see in Iran, in India, Pakistan, the dynamics is, we're just going to build a peaceful nuclear plant to generate energy. But in fact, and there's many spin-offs of nuclear byproducts of generating nuclear energy that are used in military.
So in Japan, how else did the United States influence and affect the Japanese government and people?
Well, it was Japan essentially was a colony of the United States. The San Francisco Treaty theoretically gave the self-government, gave the Japanese back their self-government. But in that era of the Cold War, of course, you had George Kennan, with his philosophy of containment. We've got to contain communism. We've got to contain the Soviet and then the Soviet Chinese polities and their sort of imperial system. So Japan and Germany became the sort of key points of containment. And so in Japan, the top Nazis, many of them the financiers, were incorporated into the CIA. The Nazis, after all, grew up as an anti-communist. Their preoccupation was anti-communism. So after World War II, that expertise in anti-communism, if I could call it that, was incorporated into the U.S. National security state, military-industrial complex. So Japan and West Germany were, very geopolitically central points of engagement in the Cold War. So a lot of the government in those polities, it was on a covert level, but U.S. was pulling many of the strings.
So did the United States intervene in the political process through the parties, the Liberal Democrats?
The whole thing was, Shariki would be a perfect example. I mean, once you're controlling the media, you're controlling the political culture. And, what we're seeing with Fukushima right now is yet more proof that the commercial media in the United States, and I include the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in Canada, the BBC in Britain, the Australian Broadcasting Corporations, they are not in the business of public education, giving the public what we need to know for our interests so we can survive. I mean, this whole nuclear energy industry, there's a fair amount of education, public education, that needs to take place. When you start to talk about a half-life, a radionuclide having a half-life of so many hundreds of thousands of years, these are not easy concepts. This whole realm of science is on the frontiers of human knowledge and understanding. So here is yet another demonstration that the mainstream media are holding back basic information that we require to make the political decisions that we need to do. And without an informed citizenry, without a citizenry given access to the important information of what's going on in our times, it's a kind of fraudulent political system. And we do live in an era where our political culture is so bought and paid for, is such an extension of global corporations and these huge concentrations of wealth in very few people's hands. To maintain that system requires such a increasingly grotesque distortion of information, holding back of information. And I think the contamination, the radioactivity that we're talking about, which is going to create millions of cancers and deformities, and this is permanent. This is in the gene pool for all time. It's not like if we can go through a couple of generations we can repair ourselves. That's one of the devastating things. Depleted uranium, is being shot in shooting galleries in the United States. There just seems to be a free and open season on this kind of contamination of environments with this radioactive material, but think about the contamination of the psychological environment, of the mental environment, the twisting of information in such ways that, or the holding back of information and replacing it with disinformation, presenting a fraudulent account of what is real, presenting a basis for a public mythology. It's a toxification and a pollution of the psychological environment, the mental environment.